A reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus said, "But to what will I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to one another, 'We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn.' For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, 'He has a demon.' And the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, 'Look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.' Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds." Jesus is, just for context, in the middle of one of his epic rants. He is teaching people, but he's clearly frustrated by them. And he's just heard the news of John's imprisonment, and people are sending messages back and forth. And Jesus kind of takes off on this frustrated screed, really, saying, "Look, John came, just before this, he says, there is no greater person born to a woman than John the Baptist. He is the real deal," says Jesus. He says, and then he turns his attention to this generation of people. "To what shall I compare you? You're like children who complain. You complain about John because he was too austere. He did not drink. He did not eat. He was an ascetic. And so you accuse him of having a demon or being out of his mind. And then comes along the Son of Man," speaking of himself, "who drinks and eats with people and dines with tax collectors, and you call him a glutton and a drunkard," and all these things. Basically saying, there is no pleasing you. We're either too hot or we're too cold. And so Jesus is calling out the tendency of human culture, human groups, to get very perfectionistic. And of course, we're kind of past the height of our political season, but you don't have to look far in our common culture to see this, where we often let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Cancel culture comes out of the fact that, someone could have moved heaven and earth, or just heaven and most of earth, but here's one thing that we don't think is right about them, so everything they've done is for naught. And so Jesus is really speaking against that tendency of us, human beings, to discount a person because they're not just right. The Goldilocks thing, right? You're too hot, you're too cold, this is just right. Jesus says, we're never just right for you. So hearing Jesus' frustration and hearing, in fact, his call to us, as he says at the very end, wisdom will be vindicated by her deeds. He says, look to the fruits of what somebody is doing. If you're not sure if somebody is good or not, or if they're good but not good enough, look to what comes from what they are doing. And that should help you with your discernment of their actions and who they are, he says. So I think a little bit of boldness in us to not worry so much about being perfect, not letting the perfect become the enemy of the good. I know sometimes those of us in collective ventures like the church, we want to make sure that what we're going to do is going to be absolutely successful, or we don't want to try it because we don't want to wind up with egg on our face, or we think we've got a good way forward, but we're not sure it's perfect, so we're not sure about stepping forward. I think Jesus is saying, look, even John, who in Jesus' estimation, there is no greater human being alive, even John has his quirks, and he says, even I, Jesus, the Son of Man, am vulnerable to critique. But look at the deeds that we are doing. Look at what comes from those deeds, and then make your judgment. Of course, he says all over the place, judge not lest you be judged, and leave judgment up to God and all that. But he also knows we humans have a tendency not to be able to resist that. So as we go through our lives, let's be comforted, I suppose, that Jesus is saying you don't have to be perfect to be good. And let's do our best as we are going through this Advent season and looking at ways that we can welcome God's kingdom more fully into being, perhaps taking up with some partners in that who may or may not be perfect, but might be good enough. good enough to be partners with us as we seek new ways to welcome God's kingdom ever more fully into this world. And God knows that the world needs that kind of hope, that kind of love, that kind of peace. May God be with you today as you consider being, if not perfect, then good enough. And may God bless you and keep you this day and always. Amen.